Lecture 7, Speakers, Listeners, and Noise. So I'll start off with a scenario. You have just a very simple table in a restaurant, two people sitting on either side of the table, and one of the people smiles, the other doesn't. No words are exchanged. They just continue to sit there, and that's the end of the scenario. My question, did communication happen? Now, the really interesting thing about this is that you can process out ideas to say, well, communication requires some kind of exchange of information or ideas, some kind of thought, something that was conveyed across information that went from one head to another. In fact, this is a very good workable definition of communication from Mrs. Kristen Ascension. Communication is the exchange of thoughts, messages, or information. So given that scenario, we would probably say that the communication was essentially non-existent. There weren't really any thoughts, not anything you can put your finger on or say happened there. Was thought or idea really communicated across? Probably not. At the same time, we can recognize that it could be more complicated than this, and depending on how finely you want to define your definition, give your definition of communication, we might say that something still happened. I mean, there was some kind of something. We don't know the background on these two individuals and what was happening in the conversation before that. Let's say, were they angry at each other? And so they've had a fight and now everything's fallen silent and they're just sitting there, just sulking, and they're both angry at each other. And finally, one smiles across at the other, which is to say, you know, can we move on here? I'm ready to let go of my anger. And the other one doesn't smile back, which is to say, no, forget it, I'm still angry with you. I mean, could you do something like that? Possibly. Such even that one class I took on communication said, and I thought this was helpful, you can't not communicate. In other words, you're always communicating. Ideas are always being sent out in everything you do. Even if you try to not communicate, let's say I'm going to sit at the table and I'm not going to say anything. What did you just communicate? That you don't want to communicate, or that you don't like the person, or that there is at least the possibility that you're angry with them. So in a sense then, it's impossible to keep from communicating. Still, I think we grasp that communication, at least generally, involves, as I gave a moment ago in my definition, the exchange of ideas, thoughts, or information, the idea that a thought I had in my head appears in your head, and that those ideas were transferred in some way. Not just that information was tossed out there and I was trying to say one thing and a completely different thing entered heads, but that when at least communication is successful on some level, something resembling the same thought moved from my head to yours. Let me show you a diagram, what's often discussed as a major communication diagram, a way of analyzing what's happening. So here it is at its very most naive, its most basic and hopeful, optimistic, that you have a sender, you have a receiver, a receiver, not a sender. Okay, much better. A sender and a receiver. And then standing between the two, you have a message. And the assumption, or the underlying assumption for this framework, would go that whatever thought was in the mind of the sender, specifically the message, something that the sender wanted to get across to the receiver, he now is able to convey. The speaker is able to take an idea, the message, and that idea moves from my head across to your head. And so the result, or what appears in the other person's mind now, is intact, the message that I sent. Now, that's very, as I said, a very hopeful and optimistic way of framing the sender and receiver framework, or the message that goes on here. I'd like to comment a couple of things about it before I talk about some of the complications that are reality for this diagram. So just understand this diagram as an oversimple framing of the concept for now. And a couple of things to recognize about the elements here. Number one, the speaker has the responsibility, the task, the goal anyway, of conveying a message to the audience. And what distinguishes the speaker or the sender from the receiver is that it's really on the sender or the speaker to carry the burden of communication. The weight of communication rests upon this side of it. So we recognize in any given conversation, let's say now we're back to our scenario, two people sitting on either side of a table. Now they've become friends again. And so the conversation is flowing. We're recognizing that the conversation goes both ways. At any given time, however, there is probably a primary person speaking. I mean, we would assume that they're not both speaking at the same time, at the same degree. Both of them speaking equally, simultaneously. There's probably a person who's primarily speaking at any given moment. That person at that given moment would be the primary sender, and the other person would be the primary receiver at that given time. Let me shift over to the other side and let me talk about the receiver for just a moment. And this is whomever you are communicating with. So this receiver has also a task in the communication process. If the burden over here is on primarily bearing or carrying the weight of the conversation, sending the message. As the sender, over here the receiver has the responsibility of listening and accepting the message. One thing that gets really interesting here in terms of how we analyze the communication process, there even can be cultural expressions or cultural assumptions about who is primarily responsible if communication goes wrong. And what I mean is that in some cultural settings, the assumption would be that the primary weight of responsibility for communication going well is resting on the sender. If the speaker doesn't speak well, well, then of course nobody understood. So this comes up in proverbs like, if the students haven't learned, then the teacher didn't teach. The assumption goes, if education fails or if learning fails, then the problem is surely with the teacher. The teacher needs to make this happen. On the other hand, in some cultural settings and in some cultural situations, we will assume that the primary weight of responsibility rests on the receiver. So that in some cases, and in some groups, people will feel like, well, if the students didn't learn, they should have listened better. Because of course the teacher did fine. It's really the student's responsibility to pursue learning and find their way to it. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So the speaker is absolutely responsible to make his message clear, palatable, understandable, enjoyable, engaging. The speaker has a high weight of responsibility, but of course the receiver has the ability to stop trying. The receiver has the ability to just not listen or not even care. And I'll come in a moment to different kinds of audiences and the recognition that, yes, this is a two-way, this is a bi-directional event happening. Both people are communicating, both people are involved in this process. But before we go there, I want to go back and let's analyze a little bit more about the message. A couple of things we should recognize about that, the message coming in between, or what is actually sent between sender and receiver. First, we can divide between content and the channel, the form, or the medium. Okay, the content being the message or the ideas you're conveying, and the form being the way that you communicate it. So by content, this is just what you wanted to say. Okay, and the speaker who's sitting at the table and smiles across the table, particularly, let's say, he wants to communicate, hey, can we lay down our anger? Can we move forward with the conversation? I'm sorry for what happened. Can we move forward? Okay, that's his content. That's what he wants to communicate. The form, or the way in which he communicates it, is the choice, let's say, for instance, to communicate that through a visual gesture, through a facial gesture. So he, thinking about it, could say, I mean, here are some options. He could just say, I'm sorry, can we start over? let's not be angry at each other. Can we move forward? He could just say that. On the other hand, he could pick up a piece of paper and write it down. He could pick up his phone and message the person. All of these are expressions of the form or the medium, the method, the thing that he uses to convey his message. What he chose to do instead was to smile. And that was a visual expression, a facial expression, a way of communicating that was, I would say, rather ambiguous, has then a lot of ways that it could be interpreted. But that was his choice of how to communicate. So what I'd like you to recognize here about the message is dividing that out and recognizing, yes, there is the content. What does the person want to say? But there is also the choice of how to say it, and that can make a massive difference. If you think about each one of those choices I just gave, the choice between saying, hey, could we stop being angry and let's move forward? That's probably the clearest and most direct way of saying it. But for a multitude of different reasons, the speaker may not want to do it that way. So he chooses to just smile. The disadvantage of just smiling is that it's very ambiguous. It can be interpreted lots of different ways. And yet maybe the advantage of it is that he doesn't have to make such a commitment. It's a very just, okay, let me try this, tendentious, maybe I'll try this and see what happens. And it doesn't take a lot of commitment to do. So maybe he chooses that. If he chose to text message the person, that's very impersonal and could come across rude. So it's a little risky. At the same time, maybe it could communicate kind of a way around the impasse. I don't know. So there are pros and cons, benefits and disadvantages for each one of those methods of communication. And I'd like you to just be aware that when you communicate a message, there is the information you wanted to communicate, but then there's also the form or the method that you choose to communicate. And the method you choose will be part of your message now. It is part of your message that you chose to text message the person instead of speak to them directly. It's part of your message that you chose to do it with a facial expression instead of words. All of those are part of what you're communicating. Now, let me go back to the diagram, and I'd like to just think a bit more about what I've given you, because what I've given you is extremely simple. By giving it this way, I've assumed a couple of things, or I've implied a couple of things. One is the notion that the message is sent in only one direction. In other words, if you look at my arrow moves across this way. And it's the assumption then that the message moves from sender to receiver, and that's it. As we'll see, it's not just one direction. The story is quite a bit more complex. Another major problem with this diagram is the assumption, at least in our discussion so far, that the ideas or the thoughts that are in this speaker's head are moved across, and those same thoughts, more or less, end up intact. They arrive intact in the receiver's head. And so then when communication happens, it was what I was thinking and what I wanted to say, moves across, the message is sent, and it arrives. The receiver hears what I said. And just a moment's reflection on that tells you that it's not that simple. It's rarely going to work like that. In fact, it won't really ever work like that. The idea that the message I intended to send is the one that will arrive to the receiver is entirely too hopeful. Go back to our scenario again. The two people are sitting at the table, and the one person smiles, and the intent in his head is to think, well, can we stop being angry at each other, and can we just move forward? So he smiles across. The person on the other end of the table looks across, sees the smile, and makes an assumption, aha, so you just think this whole thing is a big joke. I mean, now you're laughing at me. You were already rude, and now you think I'm stupid. And you're just going to smile like, well. And so what you ended up with was that the message that was intended to be sent turned out to be the opposite. The intended message was, let's move on and not be angry with each other. And in fact, then the message turned out in the person's head, the receiver's head. It came in as, you're stupid and I dislike you even more. I don't even dignify you with appreciating your views. Now, the question is, did communication happen? And the answer is, on some level, it did happen because a message or information or thoughts were received. The difference or the problem is that if the thought over here, we'll call thought A, was the one that was intended to be sent, the problem is over here, thought B was the one that arrived. And so communication happened, but there was not an identity or a match between the two thoughts. The thought that was intended to be sent and the thought that actually arrived on the other end. Which brings me to recognize that there is, as I said, quite a bit more complexity to the story. And that is that we can recognize communication actually moves in two directions. So you have not just the sender sending a message, but you also have the receiver sending feedback. Now, pause for a second. Let's analyze this just a moment. The idea of it goes then, if this is the message that I'm intending to send, and this is the primary weight of the message, in fact, we maybe, even to better the diagram, could make this a thicker arrow. I mean, this is the primary flow of information. At the same time, communication also goes this way, that the receiver also communicates back some kind of response to the message. So let's say in this scenario that the sender sends a message and the person smiles as to say, well, can we move forward? Let's not be angry with each other. And so the receiver receives this message, and what the receiver interprets as the message is, oh, you think I'm stupid and this whole thing is a goofy situation and your concerns are not important. The receiver is very angry now. And so the receiver smiles back, but with a sarcastic look, like, huh. And so now the original sender is processing this. Well, that didn't seem to go well. And so the sender sends back a message. What's wrong? Can we move forward? Okay, now the sender actually moves into saying something. And now the receiver responds back and we've got a conversation. Okay, what you've gotten then in these kinds of situations is a feedback loop that is driving the communication forward, and it's actually allowing both parties to understand better. It's going to improve the communication or the quality of the communication. The concern will just be, how much of a receiver now is the original sender going to be? If the original sender sees the sarcastic smile and views that as a, oh good, they smiled back, then now maybe he's going to miss it even further. If the original sender doesn't interpret this second communication well, then we've gotten worse. So we've got a feedback loop, but we've got to work with it. We've got to understand what's happening here. And that's what I'd like to develop a bit further with you here as you work towards becoming a better speaker. I think this element, the whole concept of feedback or audience response, is one of the most basic and critical elements of communication that most students miss. And what I mean by that is good speakers are constantly and deeply aware of everything that's happening in their audience. A good speaker, as they communicate, okay, and I'm now moved from two people sitting at a table to a speaker in front of an audience, a preaching event, a teaching event. A good speaker is looking out there and watching what's happening in the audience responses and adjusting accordingly. A good speaker has to be aware of what they're doing, what they're saying, and how they're reacting. Ideally, at the end of a speaking event, I would say that you've not really paid good enough attention unless you have a pretty strong idea and memory of who was present, where they were sitting, whether they were interested, how they listened, kind of a sense of who your listeners were and what was going on within your audience as you spoke. Why? Because you're recognizing that communication is not just the message I'm sending, but that good communication or skillful communication also takes into account the feedback I'm receiving from them. Let me explain two ideas first, and then I'll build that concept out a little further. So one, just so you understand what I mean by feedback, what is this part of the equation when you're speaking, let's say, in a public setting, what's going on here? And my answer would go, if you're preaching or teaching, then you're recognizing as you look across the audience, is there an expression on someone's face that says they didn't quite understand? Someone that looks a little, no, what? And with that expression, then they just told you, you need to explain that idea a little better. Or as you're looking out and you see on their faces, oh, they got that one, right? And so that could be visual in terms of facial expression, and you're watching for that. If you're leading up to a point where you're making a very important point, you're explaining a critical concept, and you see on their faces the recognition, they got it. That one stuck. Then you can know, okay, it's okay for me to move on now. They got this one now. Or even this could be their verbal expression. I mean, there's times when people are going to say in a church setting, amen. Or they're going to show interest. Or even you're going to look out and see some kind of emotion on people's faces, some response from them that they've been emotionally grabbed by what you just said. Okay, all of that is feedback. Another form of feedback can go the opposite direction. People looking confused, people looking down, looking at their notes, looking up at you, looking at their Bibles, looking up at you, people trying to figure out what's going on. I've seen this when a person has given a scripture reference and it's not correct. And so you look out and you see people turning their pages, they're going back and forth, back and forth. Okay, a good speaker should catch that. Should catch that immediately. Why are people doing all of this shuffling around? I probably failed to announce where I'm at, or I probably gave the wrong chapter. A good speaker has to know that, and if you can go on for a minute or two without realizing that they were in the wrong text, you're not paying attention to feedback. You've got to notice that. But this could go all the way down to just complete lack of interest, people falling asleep. And in those kinds of settings, then you're recognizing that, I think I'm slipping here. I need to help people. I need to make my ideas clearer. I need to step back. Maybe I need to include an illustration. I need to do something here because people are moving on. There are times when you just gauge and you recognize that you've gone on for long enough and people are getting tired and you're just not going to be able to communicate those ideas much longer. You need to give them a break. All of this is a form of feedback, paying attention to what they're saying. And that takes me then into the second concept I wanted to clarify here, your response to that. Now, you as a speaker, you have your plan, you know what you're going to say, and it's not just that you make up everything as you go, and yet you have to have some flexibility built into what you're doing so that as you are communicating your information and what you planned to communicate, you are in a place that you could respond to what's going on out there. And that means a piece of your communication effort is given to paying attention to the audience, knowing where they're at, and knowing how to communicate with them well. Do you remember our diagram and the order of priorities that we gave to how you think about your audience? So what does the good speaker pay attention to? And you remember I argued that we're tempted to get this exactly wrong, where we focus on ourselves first, the audience second, and the message third. I argued in its place, our first priority has to be the message, but I did say that our second priority is the audience. We're only third. But the second priority would be them, and yes, I am concerned with what they're thinking. I'm not concerned with what they're thinking in the sense of I want to remain popular with them, but I am concerned with what they're thinking because I need to know how to adjust and communicate well, recognizing the feedback I'm getting. So a skillful speaker remembers who was present, how they listened. They know that information and they remember what was happening because in the entire speaking event, they were paying attention. They were aware enough of people's responses because they were constantly looking to those signals to find out, how do I need to respond? Is there something I need to explain here? Is this making sense? Am I communicating well? And they're doing that because they care so much about their message. It's critical to them to know how to communicate it well. Now, there is, however, an additional concept you've got to include in your analysis of the communication event. That concept is the concept of noise. You've got to be aware that in the communication event, things go wrong. Now, noise this is something that it's important to understand the richness or the completeness of this concept. When we think sometimes about noise, what we're hearing is just, okay, literal noise, as in someone is, making a racket outside and therefore communication can't happen. And yes, that could be a part of the concept here. If you're noticing what's happening in the diagram and the way this is set up, this block is here and it's putting a block across what would otherwise or what should be the line of communication. In other words, the message should be proceeding across, but the message is going to be distorted. Sometimes in communication diagrams, the message is drawn like this as it goes across noise. It's to recognize that the message is going to lose some of its clarity, some of the truth, or some of the information is going to be lost or distorted. Instead of idea A, I'm going to get A with a little bit of B mixed in, and that noise is the communication distortion as we go across. I would also recognize, just as before we move on, that noise is a block on both sides. So the noise also can block the feedback. And go back now again to our scenario, the two people sitting at the table, the one person smiles. What he intends to send as a message is, can we be done with this? Can we move on? Let's not be angry anymore. But the noise that came in between was the ambiguity of his chosen method. His chosen method of communicating with a mere smile is far from clear, and the result of that is that it can be interpreted in all kinds of other ways. So remember when we said that thought A was what he wanted to send, thought B was what actually arrived. Noise is the reason for that, the ambiguity of the chosen method. And when the receiver sends back feedback, the receiver sends back a sarcastic smile, and let's say that the original sender, the person who started out smiling, sees that and thinks, oh, well, that's a promising sign. The noise there was that he missed the rather obvious sarcastic element. Okay, so noise can be anything that interferes with the quality of the message. And I'd like to give lots of examples here just so we can understand the richness or the broadness of this concept. The most basic level with noise would be literal noise, or something that causes the message not to be heard. Okay, so if you have a situation with a fairly large room and let's say the microphone stops working, and so there's other noise in the room, there are fans, there's traffic going by outside, and so the people in the back of the room literally and actually aren't able to hear. Well, then the message can't arrive because they can't hear it. Even if they're straining to hear, right? Noise has still happened because they're not hearing it with full clarity. They're only hearing it partially. They're not hearing the full richness of the signal. So in that case, the message was stopped or distorted by literal actual noise. But there are so many other myriad forms of this. One expression of this could be unexpected events. I've been preaching before and someone stood up in the back of the room, a little girl. She stood up and she got sick and she vomited in the back of the room while I was preaching. So, I mean, I saw this happen while I'm preaching. She stands up, ugh. And so for now, what everyone's thinking about it. And so as the speaker, what do I do? And there's the cleanup process. Someone goes and gets a bucket and a mop, and the bathroom is right next to where I'm speaking. And so there's the noise of the water coming on, and then everyone's thinking, okay, now what will he do? And how will he clean up? And is she going to get sick again? I mean, all of those kinds of expressions. I've seen noise happen when someone is speaking and they're just unaware, and we're getting up towards lunchtime. And noise could be like a smell. Okay, so I've been in a setting where a speaker was going on and on and on, and the dinner, the supper that was supposed to come next is being cooked, and the smells are coming up. People are smelling it, and they're thinking, no, okay, when this guy gets done, then we can finally go eat. Why won't he stop? And so the noise in this case is the wonderful smell that's coming up, and the speaker who's being completely unaware that everyone's hungry and it's past time and he's late. He's just not aware of it. Noise could be in the form of the speaker's failures. The speaker could be doing bad gestures or annoying mannerisms. He could be saying things that are obnoxious, and all of that would be expressions of noise. This could be expressed in culture, that across two different contexts, something means something different. This is Winston Churchill. He was the prime minister during World War II, and part of what kept the UK going in opposition against the Axis powers that were invading across Europe. Well, one of the things that became his hallmark was the victory sign, V for victory. And his idea was, we're not quitting until we win. One thing he did not realize, initially at least, and this is probably because he was part of the aristocracy or the rich elite, and he just was unaware of what this symbol meant in other parts of society. But there's, in at least British context, a difference in meaning between this and this. And the sign he's doing here is actually a vulgarity. So that he did this, the picture was taken, and this is a rude gesture. Well, time goes on and someone explains to him, that has a bit more of a meaning than that. And so if you see the later pictures with Mr. Churchill, he starts doing it this way instead. What's happened there is that it's a bit of a culture difference, in the sense that the part of society that he primarily inhabited didn't use the sign that way. He wasn't aware of it, and so he's communicated something that he didn't intend to communicate. He communicated a bit more information than he wanted, and that is because of noise. Okay, in all of these cases, then you're recognizing that noise is present and you've got to take it into account. And in a moment, I'll give you some practical considerations for how to work with noise. Let's just recognize philosophically or conceptually that noise will always be present. Communication is never perfect. The message never arrives exactly as you sent it. It always comes together with some other ideas that you did not intend to be there. Communication is never perfect. And so part of the task of the communicator is that you're always contending with noise. You're always trying to make your message as clear as possible. And you're always trying to clear out any of those distortions. Your goal being that you want the message to arrive from your mind to their mind as intactly and as accurately as possible. Let me move then to talk about some practical recommendations for how to communicate well. And I'll start off with our core concept for this lecture, which we've already developed at some length. That concept is that communication is a relationship. Communication is a relationship. It's common to say that you build relationships through communication, but I'm going the other direction, and I'm saying that communication already is a kind of a relationship. What I mean by that is, going back to our diagram, we recognize that communication is not just me sending a message and that's it, but we recognize that there is reciprocity. There is back and forth here. The lines go both directions. And yes, it turns out to be cyclical, reciprocal. It goes both directions, and it's a relationship. When you're communicating, there are things that are happening here. You are, by choosing to communicate, you are saying to the other person, okay, trust me. I'm sending a message across. Will you hear it? Will you receive it? And the person on the other hand is telling you whether they intend to trust you, whether they like you, whether they want to receive your message, whether they're interested, whether they care or not. And this is now a relationship. Both directions, communication is happening. Communication, critically, is a relationship. And as such, that means you have a responsibility to think through, to work with the relationship, and to know what's happening here. Communication involves both sides interacting. And some practical implications of that then, I'm going to give you three. Number one, know yourself. You need to know your strengths and your weaknesses as a speaker. You need to work at those strengths and weaknesses. But it's more than that. If it's a relationship, then we recognize that it's not just me getting up as kind of an impersonal, robotic type speaker. Now I speak, now you hear, okay, that was your job. But we recognize that the communication event depends upon, yes, my relationship to them. I think it matters then, once you process this, that you're aware of how they view you even before you speak. You work at loving people and caring about them. You work at demonstrating your concern for them even before you get up to speak. I think a wise speaker is aware of this, even if you come into a group of people that you don't know very well. When you come in, you want to express care and concern for your audience. You want to talk to people. You want to get out there and shake hands and be friendly. Even as people are coming in and they're watching, if they know you're the speaker, and they may never have met you before, but if they know you are the speaker, they're watching how you conduct yourself in conversation before you even get up. All of that is part of the event. But I think more practical still would be to know your audience. And I'll give you three kinds of audiences, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about how you work with some of this. But there are friendly, hostile, and apathetic audiences. Friendly audiences are interested in what you're going to say. The challenge of a friendly audience, they like you, they want to hear your words. The challenge is that you need to find a way to connect with them in a fresh way. In other words, if they just like you, okay, well, yeah, all right. They feel like they already know you. They've already heard what you're going to say. And so on some level, they might almost not be interested because, well, we already know what he's going to say. And that's why I think if you're speaking regularly to the same audience, let's say a pastor in a church, a teacher in a Sunday school class, you're doing that regularly, I would strongly commend starting off with a core critical question that you raise for them. What about this? And I think that'll be part of the communication event. A hostile audience is certainly harder. This is an audience that is already against your message. So in a ministry context, this might be street preaching, or this might be going into a setting where people are already making assumptions about you that are negative. They don't like what you're going to say. I would argue, however, that of these three, the hardest is the apathetic audience, the audience that just doesn't care. And again, my best advice here would be to raise some kind of critical core question. Or you've got to draw them in. You've got to help them see why this matters today. And I would say this is the most common audience we're dealing with. When we're speaking, especially week by week, every week to the same group of people, they're just not interested because it's probably the same thing you said last week. You better have something that's able to connect with their situation and draw them in. I'll pass in comment here before I go on. When you go then into the speaking situation, it's critical that you know your audience and that you know them well. It's critical that you've thought about who they are, you've thought about their needs, their concerns, you've thought about what's going on with them today. You've thought about the standpoint that they bring to this. And if, for instance, you found yourself speaking in a new setting, you're going somewhere you've never been before, you should, as a speaker, be asking a lot of questions about that situation. What are these people primarily, religiously? What's their background? Have they been in church? Are they aware? Are they familiar with church terms? Do they know in the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament? If I say to them, turn to Ephesians, do they know where to go? You should be asking those kinds of questions. And you should be aware of them enough that you can do something to connect or to react to that situation. But finally, the third element I would say here is not just knowing yourself and your audience, but finally knowing your situation. And by situation, I mean a lot of things. Your situation can include how much time you have in this occasion. Your situation can mean the room layout, where everyone's seated. It could mean being aware of the schedule, what comes next. It includes the entire package of everything that's going on. So let me give you a couple of practical pointers here or recommendations. If you know that the audience is normally, or this event is normally finished at a given time, okay, normally they finish by 12 o'clock, don't go past that. At 12 o'clock, you're not really communicating anymore anyway. They're thinking about lunch at that point. When you come into a room, be aware of room layout. And this would be different if it's a church, if it's already set up, that's the way it is. But if you come into a room and it's more of a casual event, you ought to think. If you're the speaker, think about, where am I going to sit? It will make a big difference. You could ask people to move forward, or you could adjust where your podium is. If they're all sitting in the back and it's an informal Sunday school type of situation, maybe you move your podium back towards them and be as close as possible to them as you can. Okay, you take some steps to think about the room and the layout. You adjust to the formality of the occasion. If this is a situation where everyone's dressed up and it's, let's say, like a graduation event, then you speak in a very different way than you would speak if it's more casual. You think about the temperature. Are they hot? Are they tired? Did they just eat? Sometimes I've spoken in anniversary contexts where they've just eaten a major meal, and so then after the meal is done, now I'm speaking, I'm the next event. Well, because they just ate, everyone's thinking about that. Okay, so I'm going to adjust accordingly. I might mention something about that. I know that we're all tired, and so I will do my best here to help us stay focused. Okay, things like that, we recognize these are part of the challenges. Have they been sitting down for a long time? Maybe give them a chance to stand up before you start to speak. And you could do that by saying, stand with me as I read the Word of God. As you read your passage, they stand up. It gives them an opportunity to kind of stretch. Human beings need to stretch sometimes. Okay, all of these issues or all of these situations are part of the total situation. One other practical point, and then I'll come to our conclusion. And the practical question goes, what should you do when things go wrong? Okay, some of the situations I said earlier, someone got sick during the service. I've had situations where an animal was running around, a little mouse got free and the mouse is running around in the front, or a really large cockroach keeps on flying up and flying, landing on the podium and then flying back down, and extremely distracting. Okay, a couple of things with this. Number one, you will not handle this situation unless you're already being a good speaker by paying attention. And if you see the audience and they're all looking away on a certain event, then you should know what that event is. I mean, if everyone in the audience knows about something going on, you should know. You should at least be aware and recognizing, noticing, why is everyone looking that way? And if necessary, you might need to ask them, well, what's going on? Okay. You might need to acknowledge what's happening. Part of the problem or part of the struggle for an audience in that situation is that they're wondering if you know. And if you seem like you're completely oblivious to this event in progress, part of the mental noise for them is, why doesn't he know about this? So finding out about it, or if you do know about it, just recognizing it is a really good way of helping people. And usually in those situations, if something keeps on happening, let's say, I don't know, the fans are blowing something and a piece of cloth flies up and flies up and flies up, and you see everybody noticing it, you might comment on it. You know, I know this is a little distracting. Maybe we can put something up here to hold this down. Maybe somebody will come up and help, or maybe you'll go do it. Go ahead and take care of the issue, rather than just letting people continue to struggle with it. An animal's running around, the mouse is there, you might either see, can we do something about this? Or in some settings, you might say, I know there's a distraction here. Let me ask you to do your best to stay with me. And that just helps people kind of clear the issue a little bit. Helps them know that you know about it, and it helps them move forward. Acknowledge it, recognize, okay, there's a distraction. Let's go forward. Let's do our best to focus and let's move forward, and then go forward with confidence. In a very serious situation, then this is something maybe that, is a little bit troubling, or people are really mentally distracted. Then you might need to clear the issue and stop and pray. And I've done this before. I was in a situation where a pastor was preaching, and in the middle of the preaching, he started having fairly serious health problems. His heart was racing. He was concerned. And so he stepped down and he said, I need to stop. And he went and he left. Okay, well, so I took over and to keep on preaching for him, stepping in the situation. I know that the entire audience is thinking about him. They want to know, is he dying? He was fine, by the way. But they want to know, is he okay? Is he going to be healthy? And so I'm going to say, before I start preaching, let's pray together for our pastor. So we prayed together as a congregation. We asked the Lord to help him and give him grace. And then we asked the Lord to help us to continue and think about his word and to continue our focus. And then we moved forward. Okay? And that, I think, is something you probably need to do to help people just mentally clear it. If it's not such a serious situation, something like the animal running around, you might make a joke, you might just point it out, and then move forward. And in those kinds of situations, I think it really helps people to acknowledge the need and the distraction, and then to help them clear that before you go forward. I'm going to conclude our time just by connecting everything we've talked about with our overall idea for this course. We have worked through this diagram. We've worked through the key elements of the communication process, the elements being the sender, the receiver, and the message, and then recognizing elements like feedback and noise that are part of making that process a little bit more complicated. But we've left out a key actor or another key element in this entire diagram. And that key element relates to our core foundation for this course. God wants his words to be spoken. If we value those words, we will learn to speak them well. And our emphasis with that concept, God wants his words to be spoken. We speak his words. Our emphasis with that concept goes that it's really not, at the end of the day, our message. So that if you recall the diagram that we used here, sender and receiver, and the sender sends his message, it's actually a little more complicated than that. It's not us creating the message. We are the senders, but God is the author. And that means then that as the senders of the message, actually we're only relaying what he said. That also means our relationship to the audience is all the more weighty. It's not just a question of how I relate to the audience. And remember, our concept for this lecture is that communication is a relationship. But it's not just my relationship with them, but it's more than that. I'm speaking as an advocate for God. I'm speaking in the role that we see in the Old Testament prophets, thus says the Lord. When we declare his truth, we come to the audience as people under God ourselves. I speak under God's authority, and I speak to them as people under God's authority. And we convey the truths that he has told us and what that truth means for them. And so if I put all of that together, I recognize that my communication diagram has left out a major element. When I'm speaking in these capacities as a preacher or a teacher, when we're conveying God's message, then there's a critical relationship here. It's the relationship between God and me as the speaker. It's the relationship between God and my audience as receivers. It's even the relationship between God and his message, because it's his, not mine. And what that does then is drive the entire communication event so that all of this must be carried out under God, under his authority, under his headship. God is the one then that is the ultimate accountability, the one to whom I am answerable for all of this communication. And that takes then the weightiness of this event to another level. You have to recognize the emphasis, such as in 1 Timothy 6 or 2 Timothy 4, that I charge you before God, in the presence of God and Jesus Christ, in the courtroom of heaven, preach the word, Paul says. Why in the presence of God, and why with God as the final accountability? Because it's his message, which we are communicating under his authority. And the basis of our authority as we speak to the audience is that this message is not ours, but it's his. And my argument then in all of this is to say, don't leave God out of your analysis of the speaking event. Don't leave him out of the whole framework: speaker, sender, receiver, and message and feedback. Recognize that standing above all of it is God as the one who has spoken, the ultimate sender of this message, and God is the one to whom I am answerable as sender, and whom they are answerable to as the receivers, that all of us then must answer to God about how we have accepted his message. If we value God's words and we value the significance of what he says, if we remember who he is and that he is ever present in each speaking event, we will work hard to communicate well. Communication is a relationship. It's a relationship between sender and receiver. It's a relationship carried out under the authority of God himself. And it's a relationship then with him. Have I communicated his words well? Well, he then is the accountability and the judge. And if we value his words, we will communicate well in relationship to him because we love him and because we love his words.